Create in me a clean heart and purify me. Create in me a clean heart so I...
Good morning, good morning, good morning. Welcome, 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 welcome. My name is Dr. Byron Martin. I have the pleasure of serving as your moderator for our sessions today. And so you'll see a lot of me, but you hopefully won't hear a lot from me as we're going to give space and time for our speakers to go and deliver important content towards building up our communities and building up our nation and building up the world that will be unified for the cause of Christ and unified in terms of the cause of racial reconciliation. This is brought to you today by the Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action. The Carl Spain Center was created to honor the legacy of Dr. Carl Spain by conducting research on historical and contemporary role of race and racism in the church and in its Christian institutions. The center heavily emphasizes spiritual formation by utilizing prayer, solitude, biblical meditation, and silence as methods to address racism that is often spiritualized in the hearts of Christians. And so, as we come to the Racial Unity Leadership Summit today, one of the events put on by the Carl Spain Center, it is to do that, it is to think deeply and critically about race in our country and to understand what is Christians' role in bringing that to a place of reconciliation and bringing health back to our country in terms of racial unity. And so it is with that that we're excited to come, though virtually, to Minneapolis, Minnesota. And we are exceedingly thankful for our host congregation, the Minneapolis Church of Christ, and their senior pastor, Dr. Russell Pointer. Dr. Pointer was called to the Lord, called by the Lord above to preach and teach the Holy Word from a young age of 11. He was brought up and mentored in the Harlem Church of Christ in Harlem, New York. Dr. Pointer attended Southwestern Christian College in Terrell, Texas, where he received his Associates of Arts and Bachelor's of Arts degrees. And then Dr. Pointer went on to attend and receive a master's and doctorate in theology from Omega Bible Institute and Seminary. I'm excited to ask Dr. Pointer to come and give us a welcome and then pray over our session and time today. Dr. Pointer?
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it. We're excited about partnershiping with the Spain Center. We are elated to be affiliated and associated with them. Just real quickly, I wanted to give you how we got here. I have a little bit of background. I'm an advocate for bridges to reconciliation and building bridges where we can. And I truly believe my motto is if you're going to be a bridge builder, you have to be willing to be walked on and driven over. And if you're not willing to be walked on and driven over, then you don't. This is not a good field for you to be in. But several times here in Minneapolis, we had an opportunity to start it. Myself and Jordan Tatum, who was at the Woodbury Church of Christ at the time. I've been talking about doing something for race relations. We finally got together. He went to California and saw Jerry's piece, Dr. Taylor's piece down in California. He came back excited and said, "Doc, I see what you're saying now." He went to his elders, got the money, and we started this program a couple of years ago. Well, this year, the elders at Woodbury decided to give me the ball and tell me to go with it. So I decided at that point that I would take the ball and I would go get a good friend of mine who already has a model of doing this kind of work with social injustice. So I went to school with Dr. Jerry Taylor. And so I said to him, what do you want to do? And he said, well, I think we should come to your place. And so I said, well, I feel that it's got to be in Minneapolis because after the George Floyd saga, that was a catalyst that really stirred up a lot. So I said, well, let's bring it here to Minneapolis. And so we're trying to bring it here. And then COVID was still here. So we decided to do it virtual. And I'm excited to just bring them even virtually, even though they're in their own cities. And some of them are in warm climates than we are. It's 20 degrees here and it's 80 degrees where they are. We're jealous. We're hurting. And so anyway, I won't get on that. I don't want to digress. But I do want to say that we are excited to be a part of this partnership with Dr. Jerry Taylor from the Spain Center. But anyway, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. I just want to thank you guys for being here. I want to welcome you to the virtual. I hope you stay tuned all day. I do have a lunch break later today, but just all you can't stay all day with us, and I think you're going to learn a lot. And again, I thank Abilene and the Carl Spain Center in particular for their sponsorship, and also the Woodbury Church of Christ for their sponsorship as well. Let us pray. Father God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for this moment. We ask you, God, to be with us as we tackle the tough subjects, as we embrace and as we try to talk about some uncomfortable conversations. But Father, it's necessary that we talk about them, break down these strongholds and these barriers that's causing us not to be one in Christ Jesus. We pray, Father, that you would give these panelists, these speakers, anoint their lips with clay, saturate their mind. May they speak as the oracles of God. We ask you to be with them in their own ministries. Bless the churches where they come from. Bless this program today. Bless these facilitators and all of those, Father, that's going to be a part of this. Bless their mind. Give their mind ready, sharp, regulation of the thing they're studying. Again, we thank you. And we thank you for Dr. Jerry Taylor for his directing this today. And I thank you for allowing us the partnership, and I ask you to bless this union and this covenant. In the mighty name of Jesus, we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much, Dr. Pointer. Now it's with great pleasure that I get to welcome to the conversation Dr. Jerry Taylor, who is a mentor, friend, guide to so many, but specifically God has tasked him and blessed him and called him to this work of racial unity, especially in God's church. And so Dr. Taylor in 2018 is the founding director and started the Carl Spain Center to do this work, and has been doing it rigorously years before, and has doubled down with the Carl Spain Center to make sure that this work is moving not only in Abilene, Texas, but throughout the nation and in many ways throughout the world. So it's exciting to welcome Dr. Jerry Taylor.
Thank you, Byron. I appreciate you so much and your willingness to serve with us here, to the glory of God, and moderating the entire program today. We appreciate that. I want to thank my dear friend, Dr. Russell Pointer. As he stated, we go way, way back. We won't say how far back, but we go way back. And it's always a joy to get to share company with him. He's a wonderful, wonderful child of God and a dear friend. And we were just excited about the opportunity to bring the Racial Unity Leadership Summit to Minneapolis, especially on the heels of such a tragic event. And so our desire, as Dr. Pointer has pointed out, is to seek through God's guidance a way to speak into our current hour of crisis. The country is definitely in a very dangerous place right now, and we need all of God's people with their minds filled with as much spiritual clarity as possible to speak into this moment. As you will see on the program, we have different subjects that will all be pointed in the same direction. In the middle of the day, I think we're going to be talking about rage, white rage and black rage. And I think these are the things that we need to really address from a spiritual perspective that will help us to better move forward together as opposed to moving apart as enemies. So may God bless our time together today. And again, thank each of you for taking time to participate in this event today. So I'll turn it back over to you, Byron. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Taylor, for your leadership. Well, as we get ready to jump into our time today, and we're going to hear from several incredible speakers as well as panelists that have developed and have been thinking about what does it mean to move our community forward. They're going to bring you some topics today that are going to challenge you. They're going to press you. I'm going to ask that you stick in with the topics. I'm going to ask that you don't run away from that discomfort, but that you lean in and really try to gain what God is trying to do in this space. So with that, I got to give us some ground rules and maybe some preparation for our time today. Because we're in this virtual space, one of the things that I'm going to ask that you do is that you mute your mics, mute your microphones. But you don't have to mute your video. So mute your mics, but not your video. The speakers enjoy seeing the encouraging head nods. It lets them know that even though we're in a virtual space, they have a community that's there with them. Number two, I'm gonna ask you if you would pose all your questions either to me or to the Carl Spain Center. What this is gonna allow our speakers to do is gonna allow them to move through their presentation seamlessly, and then we will bring those questions to them at the end as time is available for those questions on here. But we will still give those questions to the speakers even afterwards so they can address it on platforms that they have and on platforms connected to the Carl Spain Center. Because this is not just happening on Zoom, it's also live on Facebook. We will try and make sure we keep up with the questions and comments that are coming on Facebook as well. And one of the most important things that you can do is know that it's not too late to invite a friend. So you can always take the link and toss it over to your friends. Let's get them on this Zoom platform today so that we can all engage in this conversation. Our first session for this morning on treating the root of racism is going to be led by Bobby Green. The title of the session is Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class. Bobby Lee Green Jr. was born in New Jersey, reared in Maryland and in Florida, and added to the Body of Christ in 1997. He began his ministerial calling over 20 years ago in Orlando, Florida, where he was raised as a youth. In addition to serving as a preacher for congregations in Florida, Tennessee, and South Carolina, he served as a Bible instructor for Harding Academy, located in Memphis, Tennessee. He holds a bachelor's degree in biblical studies and a master's in divinity. He is married with 3 children. We have a great opportunity to hear from Brother Bobby Green today. And so without any further ado, I'll turn it over to you, Bobby Green.
Thank you, Brother Byron Martin, for the introduction. I want to thank Dr. Taylor and the Carl Spain Center on Race Studies and Spiritual Action for the invitation to speak. I'm encouraged this morning that in honor of George Floyd's death, that this summit has been organized to mobilize us for contemplation and action. Bryant Gumbel is, but Bill Cosby isn't. Lena Horne is, but Whitney Houston isn't. Andrew Young is, but Jesse Jackson isn't. And neither is Maya Angelou, Alice Walker, Clarence Thomas, or Quincy Jones. And even though both of them try extremely hard, neither Diana Ross nor Robin Givens will ever be. All my life, for as long as I can remember, I grew up thinking that there existed only 2 types of Black people: those who passed the brown paper bag and ruler test, and those who didn't. Those who were members of the Black elite, and those who weren't. The book I'm going to be talking about today is called Our Kind of People, Inside America's Black Upper Class. It was written by a man named Lawrence Otis Graham, who is an attorney, a commentator on race, politics, and class. He is a graduate of Princeton University, Harvard Law School. He's authored at least 13 books, and he's had essays that appear in the New York Times, U.S. News and World Report. In this book, he wants to enlighten us, enlighten America, that there is and always has been a significant wealthy class of Black people from the time of slavery till now who've existed outside of Black America's working and urban class. He says, although I spent 6 years researching our kind of people, I could have never been prepared for the controversy that it elicited from various groups upon its initial publication. Although there is a constant cry for diversity in our media, our literature, our history books, and in our communities, it became obvious to me that there are certain narrow stereotypes, even within an integrated society, that people are simply unwilling to relinquish. The stereotype of the working class Black or impoverished Black is one that whites as well as Blacks have come to embrace and accept as an accurate and complete account of the Black American experience. Our kind of people seeks to upset that stereotype. He says, although this is a world I've known all my life, and although it's an important part of our nation's history, it's a world that is filled with irony and conflict. This book provided me an opportunity to reveal a rarely discussed aspect of American history. It was an opportunity to capture the stories and the lives of people who have lived at the boundary of two worlds and been misunderstood by both. I want to survey this book, and as I go through the outline, I need to be able to share my screen, so hopefully I'm able to do that now, and I'll kind of go back and forth. And what I want to do as I go through this analysis of the book is to share with you several readings and quotations that I feel that will give you a good taste of what this book is all about. All right, the origins of the Black upper class. And we're going to come back full circle to that. But unlike my brother, I already knew that there was an us and there was a them. There were those who could look back 2 or 3 generations and point to relatives who own insurance companies, newspapers, funeral homes, local banks, trucking companies, restaurants, catering firms, farmland, and there were those of us who couldn't. He said there were those of us who had families that had a handsome picture of people with good hair, wavy or straight, with nice complexions, light brown or nearly white, with sharp features, thin nose, thin lips, sharp jaw, and curiously non-Negroid hazel green or blue eyes. And then there were those of us that didn't. He said, I had a precious few of those, while many I knew, played with, were able to check off all the right boxes. In fact, I knew some who not only had complexions 10 shades lighter than that brown paper bag and hair as straight as any ruler, but I also had multiple generations of good looks, wealth, and accomplishment. And of course, I also knew some Black kids who couldn't claim anything. It was a color thing. It was a class thing. And for generations, Black people, color and class, have been tied together in such a way it's not easily separated. Since I was born and raised around people with the focus of many of these characteristics, he said it should be no surprise that later on I decided at the age of 26 to have my nose surgically altered so that I could further buy into the aesthetic biases that many among the Black elites hold so dear. He said his grandmother said, niggers, niggers, niggers. She said under her breath, while staring at the oversized pages of texts and photos of popular Negro politicians and entertainers and sports figures who were busy making the news in '68. Great-grandmother Porter, the daughter of a minister, housemaker, extremely proud of her Memphis, Tennessee, middle-class roots. While still a child, she wore the silk taffeta dresses, taking several years of piano lessons, managed to become fluent in French. Her daughter followed in her footsteps, wearing similarly elegant dresses, taking music lessons, attending private Lemoyne School a few years ahead of Roberta Church, the millionaire daughter of Robert Church, the richest Black man in the South. She often reminded us that one of her sisters, Beanie, then grown and married, had lived for years on Mississippi Boulevard next door to Maceo Walker, the most affluent and powerful Black man in Memphis. She was proud of many things, but like many of blacks in her class, she was able to limit her interactions that she and her family had with such Jim Crow indignities. Rather than ride at the back of the bus, she sent her daughter to segregated public schools. She and her husband bought a car and paid for private schooling, so she didn't have to go to those schools. For my great-grandmother's life had been generous enough that she could create an environment that kept her from dealing with the bigotry just outside her door. She often said, and I'm paraphrasing, she didn't think much of the civil rights movement. She said, quote, "I don't see anything civil about a bunch of nappy-headed Negroes screaming and marching around in the streets." Even though later on he found that several of her and her friends had donated to the NAACP. Said she didn't like Marvin. She didn't like Marvin Gaye. She didn't like Aretha Franklin or that loud Baptist music. She said, when are we gonna get beyond all this low class Baptist spiritual sounding rock and roll music? Even though sometimes she would sneak over to the Baptist church. Now we do. She was proud when a black man finally won the Academy Award, but she was so disappointed that Sidney Poitier seemed to be so dark and so wet with perspiration. Her views may seem so unforgiving, he says, but she came from a class that valued appearance and social economical background as much as she did race, maybe more. He goes on to talk about the kind of churches, how do you move and navigate and get into this? Well, a lot of people got into it through the church, and not just any church. The Episcopal Church was the church for upper class black folks. The Episcopal faith, he said, was attractive because of its formality. Both faiths were appealing because the Episcopal and the Congregational Church, the Congregational Church, like both of those churches, because they were formal. And they had well-educated clergy and a small number of members. In other words, what attracted them most was the fact that there wasn't too many black people there, and it was a small group. He mentions that you can go in any of these communities and find these churches. There's an Episcopal or Congregational church that dominates the upper class and the religious scene in Chicago was St. Edmunds or Good Shepherd. In Detroit, it was St. Matthew. In Philadelphia, St. Thomas. In Memphis, Second Congregational. In Charleston, St. Mark's. In Washington, St. Luke's. In Atlanta, First Congregational. In New York, St. Philip's. This is where the black elite would hang out at. This is where they went to church. So for whatever reason, the choice does keep the elite separated. And just as there have been special churches for the upper classes, there have been special social groups that separate men, women, and children. And so the rest of the book basically is a survey of all the, where do you find the black elite? Because in order to be a part of the elite, you have to be in the right groups. And so he talks about Jack and Jill as a group that he was a part of and that many of black elitists were a part of. He says, quote, "How does one get in? By the time I was in the 5th or 6th grade, I was pretty well aware that Jack and Jill was something that distinguished me from other kids, even the black kids at school, because being the black kids, in addition to the white students and white teachers, had never even heard of the group. Because being the black kids, in addition to the white students and the white teachers, had never heard of the group, it was like belonging to a secret club. It was something that I could rarely talk about to maybe one or two other kids. He said one was the son of a physician, the other was the son of an IBM executive. And the other black kids at school who lived in public housing or modest homes, they were outside Jack and Jill. There were no applications to get into this group. This is why many blacks resented it, because the only way you can get in is you had to be invited in. You couldn't buy your way in. If you weren't in the right class, you didn't get in, and money was not enough. And then he goes on to further this discussion about the black child experience. So the right cotillions and camps and private schools. It wasn't enough just to go to private school. You had to go to the right private school, the right cotillion. You couldn't just go to camp. You had to go to the right camp, he says. Getting their kids into Jack and Jill, he says, was not the only strategy that the Black elite used to ensure that the next generation got off on the right foot. Since most kids were placed in the organization by their 4th or 5th birthdays, membership preceded their entrance into the designated debutante cotillions, private schools, clubs, and Black summer camps whose sole purpose was to cater to the affluent Black child. Summer camps, he says, are an important complement to the school year activities of Jack and Jill. Founded in 1921 with 40 young campers by the late Dr. William D. Berry, Camp Atwater has historically been the only right camp for the children of the Black elite. Then he goes on to talk about the colleges that count. And so, you know, they did have pride in their HBCs, but not just any HBCs. There were low-class historically Black colleges, and then there were the elite Black colleges. And he says, even today, this is written in 1999, even today, he said that the prestigious schools to go is Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse. And the Black elites know this. If you didn't attend those 3, then you did not meet the prerequisite to be amongst the Black elites. And so Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse. He says, when I looked at educated members of the Black elite today, I made constant comparisons about whose decisions were best. Those who attended historically Black colleges and graduate schools, or people like me who attended white schools like Princeton and Harvard Law School, or still others who compromised by attending a top Black college and then a top white graduate school. So I know of happy, well-adjusted adults from each of these groups, but the groups I worry about most are the offspring of parents who have no ties to Black educational institutions. There is now at least a generation of these individuals, and I fear they will find no reason to use these schools or contribute financially to their endowments. Because I have no ties to those schools, and because my wife's 3 degrees are from Harvard, I think it's rather unlikely that our children will consider an HBC for their own future. Even though I realize or recognize the quality and the value of these institutions, my own personal choice would make me an unconvincing supporter. He says, when I look at the future of these elite Black colleges, some interesting patterns are evident. For one, the schools at the top are Howard, Spelman, and Morehouse. They will continue to attract the smartest children from the elite families because they are schools that are well respected in the white corporate and professional community. The graduates of these schools will continue to have good jobs and go on to good graduate schools. But the problem is going to come in his mind, for those students who don't attend one of the great white Ivy League schools. They don't attend one of the great Black, historically Black colleges, but end up attending a substandard Black college. Then he talks about the right fraternities and sororities. It's not enough to be in a fraternity. It's not enough to be in the sorority. The Black elites have the right fraternities and the right sororities that you must be a part of. Interesting enough, early in the book, he mentioned in that chapter was interesting. He says when he was talking about his wife and trying to introduce his wife to his aunt over the phone, he said, I could hear my aunt's anxiety level rising through the phone line. So she is an AKA. And he said, no, I don't think so. I answered, you don't think so? Either she is or she isn't. I rolled my eyes as I looked over at Pamela, the woman I had just gotten engaged to. We were on the telephone from New York, calling relatives to give them the news of our wedding, which would take place in 18 months. Most of my father's relatives had already met Pamela. My Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Earl were on my mother's side of the family and knew few of the details. Aunt Phyllis already knew that my fiance was from Detroit and had graduated from Harvard Radcliffe, Harvard Law School, and Harvard Business School. But foremost on her mind were Pamela's ties to Greek life. Well, no, I finally responded. She's not an AKA. Oh, a Delta, she asked, sounding a little crestfallen. My uncle interrupted on the line. Now, Phyllis, just because you're AKA doesn't mean everybody has to be. So she's a Delta, she asked again. I looked over at my fiance. I started to feel a little embarrassed. Phyllis, she's actually quite nice. I'm sure she is, Lawrence. So she's a Delta. Please, Phyllis. My uncle and aunt were inextricably tied to Black college life. He was an Omega who sat on the alumni board of Ohio Central State University. And Aunt Phyllis, a teacher with 2 master's degrees, had pledged AKA 46 years ago at Wilberforce, the country's 2nd oldest Black college. She's the kind of sorority member who finds it hard to believe that not every accomplished Black woman would want to be an Alpha Kappa Alpha. No, I'm sorry, Aunt Phyllis. She's not a Delta either. Oh, I see. As I looked over at Pamela, a long, awkward silence fell on the other end of the phone line. I wasn't sure what my aunt was thinking, but it was probably one of 3 things. His fiance is white. His fiance is in one of those lesser sororities. His fiance is not a Greek at all. In the world of the Black elite, where race and class and Black fraternity life are intertwined, I'm not sure which of the 3 assumptions about my fiance would have been more shocking at the moment. It is an experience I encounter whenever Blacks discover that I was not in a Black college fraternity. So he lists the fraternities and sororities, the top 3. And so, of course, on screen, Alpha Phi Alpha, Kappa Alpha Psi, Omega Psi Phi for the men, and for the women, Alpha Kappa Alpha, and Delta Sigma Theta. This is Greek life, and he says to kind of understand Greek life for Blacks and the Black elite, you have to understand that compared to their white counterparts, where fraternities and sororities basically represent a 3 or 4 year college experience, Black fraternity and sorority life is lifelong. And so the importance of being a part of these organizations and groups goes far beyond their 4 year college experience. All right. Then he goes on to talk about groups for elite Black men and women. So it's not enough to be in that's good. You got in the fraternity, you got in the sorority, you were in Jack and Jill, you went to the right camp, you went to the right college, you went to the right private school. That's not enough. Okay, so there are levels to this. And so he talks about these, professional groups, right? For Black men and women. For the women, it was links and girlfriends. For the men, the boule, the guardsmen. And in the book, he talks about other groups for elite Black men. In the beginning of that chapter, he says, what about the ones hanging on that rack or the one on that table? The saleswoman could see that neither my father, my brother, nor I knew anything about buying evening handbags. We had been to Bloomingdale's and Berkforce and Saks Fifth Avenue, finally arriving at Neiman Marcus by the late afternoon. Your mother's taking this stuff seriously, my father remarked. So it's got to be something good. As the slender saleswoman opened up a light blue cloth bag and pulled out a small purse covered with glittering crystals, she smiled broadly. This is a Judith Lieber, she said, as we shrugged our shoulders at a name that meant absolutely nothing to us. She only uses fine Austrian crystals, and it's a brand that says you've made it. In an uncharacteristic gesture of conspicuous consumption, my normally conservative father nodded anxiously. Then that's exactly what we're looking for. After he handed over something in the neighborhood of about $900, the woman put the bag and his blue cloth protector into a matching blue box, and the three of us looked at each other with the assurance that the upcoming event justified spending such an exorbitant amount of money for a handbag that wasn't even large enough to hold a wallet. Is this a wedding anniversary? The woman asked. No, he answered. My wife has just been accepted into the links. The woman offered us a blank stare, and the three of us gave each other a knowing nod. The woman was white. There was no reason for her to understand. As my mother and every other woman in her crowd would have told you, getting accepted in the links was a big deal. It was not something you needed to explain if you were in the company of the right kind of people. In this case, some would say the right kind of people didn't even include whites or blue-collar blacks. He goes on to talk about the boule, but for time's sake, we'll kind of move on. But it's amazing that he goes on now to talk about vacation spots. Like, you just don't vacation anywhere. And he lists those vacation spots, Sag Harbor, Long Island, Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard, Highland Beach, Maryland. These are the places where the elite, you wouldn't, you don't go to Disney or some resort. No, this is where you go. And he said, today's America's Black elite are closely associated with three historical resorts. As you see, they became popular as a result of the laws that had kept other vacation spots exclusively white. And so you kind of see the history of why these three designations. He says they are Sag Harbor, Martha's Vineyard, Highland Beach. And in the past, to some extent today, blacks also choose Hillside Inn, a black-owned resort in Pennsylvania, in the mountains, and Idlewild in Michigan, a small town 200 miles north of Detroit that was a popular escape for the Midwestern Black elite. He said, although it's the best known resort among the Black elite, the tiny 7 square mile village of Oak Bluffs, Martha's Vineyard, is actually mostly a white community with an only 5% Black year-round population. Expanding each year as more Black professionals from all over the country continue to buy or rent homes there. Oak Bluffs has been a popular area for the elite Black families since the 1930s and 40s. The rest of the book you have to read on your own, but he gets it's very nuanced. So he talks about how the Black elite carried themselves in Chicago, Washington, D.C., New York City, in Memphis, Detroit, and Atlanta. Talks about, in the smaller cities, Nashville, New Orleans, Tuskegee, Los Angeles, and Philadelphia. And basically what you have there is he talks about the way the elite conducted themselves in the North in many ways is very different from the South. And so he just really gives you a good nuanced perspective of North and South elites. All right. So when we look at, stop share just for a moment here. When we look at, this Black elite, when you look at it, it's like, wow, this is like, how could people become this twisted up? And you need to understand there's something behind this. And so one of the things that we explain is that the roots of this Black elitism, it goes back to slavery. When the first Africans came on the shores in Jamestown, Virginia, whether it was the Dutch or the Portuguese, these plantation owners didn't know what kind of Africans they were dealing with. They didn't know whether they were Mandingo. They didn't know whether they was Yoruba. They didn't know if they were Igbo. They didn't know if there was Ashanti. They didn't know if they were Mandinka. They didn't care. All they knew is that they were bringing them there to be slaves. They didn't care about their prior knowledge. They didn't know that many of them were already skilled in crafting, in iron, and gold, and leather, and they were already able to do so many things, but the focus was on this. We are going to capture, we are going to enslave. And all they saw was chattel property. All they saw is people that could be sold. To the traders at a sale of average price of $500 per man and $250 per woman or child, these were South Carolina prices. Eventually rose as high as $1,300 or $1,400. And so there was basically no respect for the distinctions that naturally existed in the community. And if the distinction that they were going to have was this: on southern plantations, they were divided into two general groups. There were the outside laborers who worked in the fields. They harvest the rice, the tobacco, they cut the sugar cane, they pick cotton, they built roads. They were the ones that worked at smelting iron. They dug wells, they laid bricks, they built many of the plantations and the buildings. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, George Washington's Mount Vernon, are all built by slaves. And for the most part throughout the South, this is how these laborers lived: in windowless, unfloored shacks, structures close to their owners' livestock, living near animals. But there were a second group of slaves, those who performed the more desirable jobs inside the master's house. Now, they did the cooking, the cleaning, the washing, and tended to the more personal needs of the owner's family. While these laborers were also slaves with no more or fewer rights than the outdoor workers, the distinctions between the slaves in the fields and the slaves who served as the butlers and the mammies in the house weren't subtle at all. The term house nigger and field nigger grew into meaningful labels as generations of slaves in the master's house gained more favorable treatment, had access to better food, better work conditions, better clothing, and of course, introduced a level of intimacy with the owner's family with minimal education, most of all, non-consensual sexual relations. And so a caste system is being built between those in the house and those who are in the field. The plantation owners began to put the more lighter skinned slaves in the house, and thus creating a greater division between the groups, now based on physical characteristics and not just some kind of random assignment. These light-skinned blacks were often perceived as receiving greater benefits. They didn't always receive, it's the perception that they were perceiving greater benefits and a more comfortable lifestyle, and a resentment amongst the dark-skinned field slaves began to grow. Not surprisingly, both whites and house niggers came to consider the dark-skinned field niggers to be less civilized and intellectually inferior because those in the house were getting better education. Since many white slave owners established these forced sexual relations with their female house slaves, the mulatto offspring, who were also assigned slave status, extended the size of the house slave staff. In fact, it was to the owner's benefit to mate with as many of these female slaves as possible so that each new child would become a slave. While none of these illegitimate offspring had any more rights, they did become a part of this growing phenomenon of the lighter complexion South slaves who separated themselves from those who were dark-skinned and in the field. This is the beginning. This is the root of Black elitism. Then, of course, when you had free blacks, they also separated themselves as well and began to be listed as such. Free blacks in the South were generally required to carry papers proving that they were not slaves and required to register annually in their counties. Listing their white guardians, however, they were permitted to work for money and to own property, thus creating the first opportunity for blacks to establish families with some moderate wealth. The nucleus of the Black elite was formed around these families.
I have to say this, and I'll sit down. Back during slavery, when black people like me talked to the slaves, they didn't kill him. They sent some old house Negro along behind him to undo what he said. You have to read the history of slavery to understand this. There were two kinds of Negroes. There was that old house Negro and the field Negro. And the house Negro always looked out for his master. When the field Negroes got too much out of line, he held them back in check. He put them back on the plantation. The house Negro could afford to do that because he lived better than the field Negro. He ate better, he dressed better, and he lived in a better house. He lived right up next to his master in the attic or the basement. He ate the same food his master ate and wore his same clothes. And he could talk just like his master. Good diction. And he loved his master more than his master loved himself. That's why he didn't want his master hurt. If the master got sick, he'd say, "What's the matter, boss? We sick?" He was as sick as the master. When the master's house caught a fire, he'd try and put the fire out. He didn't want his master's house burned. He never wanted his master's property threatened. And he was more defensive of it than the master was. That was the house Negro. But then you had some field Negroes who lived in huts, had nothing to lose. They wore the worst kind of clothes, they ate the worst food, and they caught hell. They felt the sting of the lash. They hated their master. Oh yes, they did. If the master got sick, they prayed that the master died. If the master's house caught a fire, they prayed for a strong wind to come along. This was the difference between the two. And today you still have house Negroes and field Negroes.
Malcolm X speaking to that very issue of the house Negro and the field Negro. One of the interesting disturbing chapters about this book is the very end when he talks about when the brown paper bag test isn't enough. And just so you have in kind of an excerpt of that.
They did a study about how people reacted to the color of the skins of the doll. And these were black children, and found out that there was this color issue within the black community of people reacting to the darker doll in a negative way from the lighter doll. And that had always been thought of, of issues. When I applied to Fisk University, you had to have a photograph. And for the most part, Fisk, Howard, and other schools, the lighter you were, the more likely you were to get into those schools.
All black schools
All
still
black
had
schools,
their
yes.
color gradation.
And those were the private schools. The public schools, you didn't have to submit a picture because it was assumed that the public school would have to let all black students in regardless of the color of their skin. But again, the lighter the child, the more likely they were to get into the state-supported schools as well. It's just that no picture was required. But there were some issues there. So this was the color consciousness issue inside
the paper bag, the brown paper bag
the brown
test.
paper bag test.
But sometimes the brown paper bag wasn't enough. And so he talks about the rules of when it's not enough, and that is the rules of passing for white. And he basically says these same rules are pretty much still in effect today. And I want to share with you some of those rules of how to pass for white. He says, number one, passing will be easier if you attempt to do it while you're at college, preferably on a campus that is predominantly white and a small rural town. He says, change your last name to one that's not associated with black family names. Avoid such surnames as Jones, Jackson, Johnson, Williams, Thomas, and Brown. In order to pass for white, recreate your family tree by describing yourself as an only child born of parents who died years ago who are also only children. Relocate to a new community that insulates you from interacting with blacks and that is at least a few hundred miles from your family home, and avoid cities like New Orleans and Charleston, South Carolina, where whites are adept at spotting light-skinned blacks who are passing. Think of some manner in which to kill yourself off in the minds of Black people who know you and your family. If your parents or siblings are willing participants in assisting you, they can say that you now live outside the country, that you have entered a cult or a religious order, or even that you have died. Realize that Blacks and not whites are the ones who can threaten your security as a Black person living a lie. Avoid any meaningful interaction with Black people. Affluent Blacks who understand the passive phenomenon may try to out you are particularly dangerous. Develop associations with organizations and institutions that will buttress your new white resume. Convert to the Presbyterian Church or the Republican Party. Contribute to charities like the Junior League or the Daughters of the American Revolution. In order to pass as white, recognize the physical features that can undermine your new identity. Avoid getting tanned at the beach. If your hair is not straight, keep it short, wear a hairpiece, or maintain weekly touch-ups. Enhance those physical features that can support your new identity, lightening your hair color, narrowing your nose, thinning your lips, and adopting a more conservative style in clothing and speech are all simple steps that can aid your transition. Realize that no one in your life, including your spouse, should be trusted with your secret, except for your adult age child, who presumably will maintain secrecy because of his or her own self-interest in living as a white person. Avoid applying for high-profile positions or admission into selective clubs or lineage-based or obsessed institutions like secret societies or prestigious co-op boards so that you will not be subjected to probing questions and searches. Avoid appearance of being secretive about your racial identity. If your physical appearance makes it possible, claim to be a white European background. If you have a darker complexion, claim to be a mixture that includes a white European background like Irish or Dutch or German or Polish, and a dark European or Middle Eastern background, Greek, Cuban, Lebanese, Portuguese. Never claim any ethnic group from continental Africa or Mexico or Central America. And he goes on to talk about avoid taking family photos, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that has got to be twisted. And on one level, you got to sympathize because our ancestors, what they went through was so abusive that this is one of the only escapes they thought. Why would you want to be Black and endure everything that's going on? So this became a solution for them. I've been doing my ancestry for the last couple of weeks. And it's amazing as I trace my family tree, you know about it, but to see that every time you go back to a generation, check a relative, you run into a mulatto. You run into a white slave master who raped your ancestors. And so this is a mindset that, hey, when we get out of this, whatever solution that it takes to get out of this, if it takes being white, acting white, whatever it is, that's what we're going to do. Black elitism has its roots in systemic racism of white supremacy. And white supremacy has a vested interest in help maintaining this caste system. It is primarily done by the conscious and unconscious attitudes of whites through overt and covert methods that seek to strive to assimilate Blacks into a cultural world of whiteness or to help them to maintain their footing under the guise of integration or diversity. Whites who are serious about dismantling white supremacy must not aid and abet in this system. Black wealth is not a problem. Black power is not a problem. Black achievement is not a problem, but Black elitism is a problem because in this country, Black elitism is rooted in the worship of whiteness. It is the internalized hatred for anything of African origin and anything that does not have the scent and the flavor of whiteness. So Black elitism is the problem, and its evils are seen in white spaces. It's seen when only light-skinned Blacks are appointed to positions of leadership in the professional world. It's seen when Black friends that whites have don't have any other Black friends. It's seen when Alice's application is accepted, but Aaliyah's application is thrown in the garbage because her name is too ethnic. It's seen when Denisha's mom has to buy a can of perm relaxer to straighten her daughter's hair out so that she can be accepted at school. It's seen when Black boys can become valedictorians of their high school but can't graduate until they cut their locks. It's seen when English school teachers who have no appreciation for African-American vernacular English tell Black children that the way they speak is wrong rather than different. This has to end. And it all comes back for those who get twisted. You don't have to be really in the Black elite, but for know we have seen this behavior, because all it is the so-called bougie, regular black folks trying to be like the black elite. And so we run into the same types of attitudes. The problem is a lack of self-love. I'm going to leave you with this clip. It is Lawrence Otis Graham, the author of this book, and he says something to say about racial profiling. And I want you to think about it. This was written, this interview was several years after he wrote this book. Let's see if our black elitism or being white, how much does it really protect us?
My name is Lawrence Otis Graham. I'm an attorney. My wife's an investment banker. We both went to Harvard. I went to Harvard Law School and Princeton undergrad. My wife went to Harvard College, Harvard Law School, Harvard Business School. And we have 3 kids, 2 boys and a girl. For us, I think it was when the Trayvon Martin incident happened, when he was shot, because we thought our boys could have been in the very same circumstance, that could easily be our own sons. So that's when we realized we had to have the conversation. We are black, we're black, but we have to address it in certain ways by making sure that we're wearing clothes that are not ones that suggest that we are part of the criminal element, as people would say. It's no hoodies, it's no dark clothes. My boys know that they've got to be khaki pants. We don't do sweatshirts with words and names on them. This is really casual for them. They don't do the t-shirt thing. And when it comes to jackets, raincoats, this is the only time you're going to see a hood in our house is on a raincoat or a winter jacket. It's no colored high tops. It's loafers, it's white tennis sneakers. It's not carrying anything in your hand after sundown that could be misconstrued as a weapon. It's also making sure that when they go to stores, they get receipts, that they walk in, they make eye contact and nod and smile to the shop owner. They make sure that their bags are zipped and left in the car or outside the store. It's also making sure that they never run when in the presence of a police officer unless it's very apparent that they're dressed for jogging. They don't go out after sundown. My younger son said, "You're taking the fun out of being a black kid," but it just knows it's necessary. And once again, it's not because we're trying to make them white. It's just the whole issue of we don't want them to be profiled. My children are surrounded by black role models, and we wanted our children to know this is what black people can become, and we're holding them at the same high standard. My biggest fear for my black boys is I don't want them shot, I don't want them tasered. It's as simple as that. It's no longer even an issue of I wanted them to be treated with the same respect and dignity of other kids that are not black, that are their age. It's just, I want to keep them alive.
I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and hope something has been said that would, help further all of our understanding of the world of the black elite and how much of that has trickled down into our spaces as well. And I hope we can see that even amongst the black elites, there's very little protection. God bless you, and thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Brother Bobby Green. We appreciate you to the highest for that. Bobby, if you would just drop your contact information in the box down below, just in case anybody has a question, they can direct it to you.